Felix rang Drexler's doorbell more from hope than any real belief that the doctor would be there, so he was pleasantly surprised when the viewing slot was opened and a servant peered out. "Oh, it's you, Herr Jäger," he said. "Are you alone?" "Yes, and I would speak with your master." "Best come in, then." Felix heard bolts being thrown and the door creak open. He glanced over his shoulder to make sure that no bandits were poised to take advantage of the situation, then hurried through. The servant slammed the door behind him. Felix strode through the corridors of the doctor's mansion. It felt like years since he had first come here with Alyssa, though in fact it had only been weeks. How had things changed so quickly, he asked himself, suppressing a flash of loneliness and sadness at the thought the woman was gone. He shook his head and smiled sadly, knowing that her departure was one of the reasons why he was here. He was just moving around to keep himself busy and avoid thinking about things. The servant showed him into Drexler's study. The doctor sat by his fire, looking drained and weary. Weeks of treating plague victims had obviously taken something out of him. There were lines on his face that had not been there when Felix had last seen him, and a hint of pallor beneath the man's tan. "Herr Jäger, what can I do for you?" "I've brought you back your book," Felix said, producing the doctor's copy of Leiber's work. "I would have returned it sooner, but I have been very busy." The doctor smiled. "So Herr Oswald has told me. It seems Aldred chose a worthy successor for ownership of his blade." "I'm not so convinced," Felix said, gesturing vaguely in the direction of the city. "All of my and Gotrek's efforts seem to have come to naught." "Do not be sure of that, Herr Jäger. What man can tell of all the consequences of his actions? It may be that things would be a lot worse without your intervention." "I wish I could believe that, but I do not think it is so." "Only Sigmar can judge a man's actions, Herr Jäger. And I believe that, in some ways, he smiles upon you and your friend. You are still here, aren't you?" "How? How many others would be able to say the same if they had undergone your adventures? I know I could not." Felix looked at him, struck by the fact that there was some truth in the man's words. "You are a good doctor, Herr Drexler. I feel better just for talking to you." "Perhaps you should wait until you see my bill before you thank me." His smile showed that he was joking. "You found what you wanted in the book?" Felix set it down on the table. "More than I ever wanted. I'm not sure that it helps knowing how evil and depraved the ratmen are." "Again, Herr Jäger, who knows what knowledge might prove useful? Have some food. I have managed to preserve something from the afflictions of our city." Felix thought guiltily of the meal which he had already eaten at Otto's. His stomach felt full, but well, on the other hand, he had no idea when he might eat again. If Gotrek's theory about the Skaven's imminent onslaught was going to be correct, he was going to need all of his strength. "Why not?" he said. "It may be the last meal I get." "Why do you say that?" Drexler asked, and Felix decided that now was the time to deliver his warning. "Because I believe that the Skaven will attack the city soon. I also think that you should leave. I say this as a friend. I thank you for the warning, Herr Jäger, but I cannot go today. You see, tonight I am attending a ball at the palace, in the presence of Elector Countess Emmanuel herself. Somehow the thought sent a shiver running down Felix's spine. Lurk knew it was going to be bad when he felt the heavy hand of one of HUGE Gotrek's troops on his shoulder, and he was hustled unceremoniously into the fat Skaven's palanquin. He found himself looking up into the folds of flesh beneath the chin of a gigantic Moulder packmaster. Grottel's huge belly virtually pressed him back against the cushions of the palanquin with a life of its own.
Now, where are you going?
HUGE Gotrak asked.
Where indeed?
Lurk thought fast. He did not like the hungry gleam that had appeared in the packmaster's eye. He thought of the letter that he bore for the Grey Seer. He thought of the disease that threatened to fill his lungs with pus unless the abbot continued to intervene on his behalf with the horned rat.
I was just on my way to see you, most majestic of Moulders.
Then it is fortunate I have found you. Tell me, what is it that you are carrying?
Lurk told him everything. He expected HUGE Gotrak to reach out with one podgy hand and snap his neck, but the packmaster merely laughed a rich, booming laugh.
It would appear the Grey Seer has been too clever for his own good. You will deliver your message, but it will be one I shall dictate, and Hesit one I shall write down.
As you wish, most potent of all packmasters.
Felix trudged back towards the blind pig, feeling almost too full to move. Over the past few weeks, his stomach had shrunk, and what once might have been a normal meal now left him feeling bloated. 2 such meals in one day made him feel like he was going to explode. He wore a new herbal talisman given to him by the doctor, and he carried another within his pouch for Gotrek. It was a slight reassurance to him. So far, he had not caught the plague, but that might not signify anything. Nobody else he knew had either. Perhaps it was mere chance that had spared them, or perhaps it was the fact that Heinz insisted they kill every last rat they spotted around the pig. Felix could not even begin to guess. He only knew that he was grateful to Drexler for the gift. He looked around into the gathering gloom and shivered. The city looked like a mere ghost of the thriving metropolis it had been when he and Gotrek first arrived. Many buildings had burned down. More were empty. No lights shone in most of the tenements. The bustling life of the streets had been replaced by an aura of fear. The only ones likely to be abroad now were predators and their victims. He felt the flesh crawl between his shoulder blades and was suddenly convinced that someone was watching him. He turned his head to look at the mouth of a nearby alley. The whoosh of air alerted him too late. Something hit him on the skull. He shook his head in response, half expecting a surge of pain. None came. He raised his fingers to his brow, but felt no blood. He looked down to see what had hit him, and saw that it was a rolled-up piece of parchment, similar to all the others which had borne a warning concerning the Skaven. He bent down to pick it up, and glanced round at the same time. He heard the sound of scuttling down a nearby alley, and realised that it was most likely whoever had thrown the paper. Without thinking, Felix scooped up the parchment and raced off in pursuit. He stretched his long legs to the maximum as he ran down the alley. Ahead of him, he thought he caught sight of a cowl figure. Was it possible that that was a long, rodent-like tail protruding out from under that monkish robe? All too possible, he decided. The figure had reached the end of the alley and turned hastily down another of the winding maze of streets. Felix raced past open doorways, scattering amazed-looked beggars and treading monstrous rats underfoot as he raced onwards. His heartbeat sounded loud in his chest, and sweat poured down his face. He felt nauseous and wished that he had not eaten so much at Doctor Drexler's, particularly after the heavy meal at his brother's. He clutched the scroll tight in one hand and restrained the scabbard flapping on his belt with the other. "Stop, Scaven!" he shouted. His words had no effect on the fleeing ratman. All the beggars leapt for cover within the nearest door. Felix raced on. "Why am I doing this?" he asked himself. As far as he knew, the Skaven ahead had done them nothing but favours of his brethren's plans. In that case, why was he fleeing? Felix asked himself, but he already knew and already had an answer. Who could tell why the ratmen did anything? Who could guess at the reasons of a creature that was not even human? Felix's heart leapt as he saw the ratmen trip and fall. Perhaps he could overhaul it after all. Caught up in the fury of the chase, he desperately wanted to do so. He wanted to grab the ratman and look into his eyes and question it. Not he thought, that it would likely understand the human tongue. According to Leiber, the ratmen had their own languages, including a number of specialized dialects used by the various clans. Still, at least this one knew enough Reichspiel to write its notes, Felix thought, so perhaps it could be interrogated. He ran faster, hope blazing in his breast that at last he might be able to get some answers to his questions about the Skaven. Lurk glanced back over his shoulder and chittered a curse. It was no use. That foolish human was still following him. Why? What did it hope to achieve by persecuting him in this way? Why could it not leave him alone and read the message that Hesit One Eye had inscribed on the parchment? If it did that, it would surely realize that it had more urgent business this night, like heading to the palace and thwarting Grey Seer Thankwell's plan. Life was so unfair, Lurk thought unhappily. Here he was, in poor health, browbeaten by some of the most ferocious Skaven who ever lived, about to make an enemy of one of the mightiest sorcerers of his race. His head hurt. His eyes burned with fever. His heart felt like it was going to give out from the strain of this race. His lungs felt like they were on fire. And where was he? Not in some comfortable burrow back in Skaven Blight, but being pursued through the horribly open streets of this human city by a large and terrifying warrior. It was like some dreadful nightmare. The sheer unfairness of it all galled Lurk. What had he ever done to deserve all of this? He shot another backward glance and saw that his pursuer was starting to narrow the distance that separated them. Lurk prayed that night would come, or that mist would arise. He felt certain that in darkness and shadow he could lose the humans. Or if he could just reach the hidden entrance to the sewers where the bulk of the invasion force waited, he would find safety. He risked another look back, and cursed as he felt his feet go out from underneath him. He knew he should have looked where he was going. Felix closed the gap quickly as he saw the Skaven scrabble to his feet. He wondered briefly whether he should pause and draw his sword. He decided against it. He would lose ground again, and the Skaven did not appear to be armed. He could always produce his blade when he had the ratman cornered. Breathing heavily, he ran on. Praise the horned rat, thought Lurk. Ahead of him, he could see the opening into the sewers. He knew that he merely had to leap down into it and he would be safe in the comforting bosom of the Skaven army. Down there waited Vilebroth Null, Isaac Grottle, Hesit One Eye, and all of their soldiers. But as he gathered his legs beneath him in preparation for the mighty leap that would carry him to safety, he felt a powerful hand clamp onto his shoulder. Felix felt the Skaven stiffen as he grabbed it. He pulled hard, spinning it around, and almost let go as the wicked-looking creature glared up at him with hate-filled eyes. Of all the ratmen he had ever encountered, this was the most sly and nasty-looking. It was smaller and thinner than most, but had a wiry strength that made it difficult to hold. "Now," Felix panted, "tell me what you're doing here." A sudden pain flared in his left wrist as the ratman bit it. Overcome by shock, Felix let go. Lurk broke free from his tormentor's grip and dropped gratefully into the sewer. Breaking the surface, he looked around and saw that the Skaven assault force had already gathered. A horde of ratmen waited in attendance. He looked around and saw Isaac Grottle and the others waiting in the leader's position at the rear. A storm vermin claw leader looked down at Lurk as he pulled himself out of the filth and shook his fur clean.
"What is it?"
the claw leader asked.
I am pursued,"
Lurk gasped without thinking. Before he could expand on his statement, the claw leader reacted, keen to grab some glory.
"Right,"
the Skaven shouted.
Quick, quick! Charge!
Felix inspected his bitten wrist. It did not look too bad, he thought. Then he glanced up in horror as he heard the first of the ratmen begin to swarm up the sewer access ladder. Only moments before he had debated whether to pursue the escaping Scaven into the sewers. Now he saw that it would be suicidal. Already, the leering face and snapping jaws of a burly, black-armoured ratman had emerged into the gloom. Felix wasted no time. He launched a hefty kick that sent the furiously squeaking Skaven tumbling back down among his fellows, and then turned and ran. Moments later, a mass of furiously chittering Skaven warriors emerged into the alley. Somewhat ahead of schedule, the great invasion of Nuln had begun.
No, no!
Lurk squeaked as the tightly packed mass of Skaven warriors surged past him. The press of furry bodies pushed him back into the foul waters of the sewer. For a horrible moment, he felt like he was going to drown, but then he broke the surface once more, just in time to see the last of the storm vermin clambering with unrestrained fury into the light. Above him, the mad face of Vilebroth Knoll leered down.
Did you deliver the message?
Burbled the low abbot of the plague monks.
Yes, yes,
Lurk chittered, thinking that now was possibly not the best time to tell Knoll that the Skaven troops above were now doing their best to hunt down and kill the man to whom the message had been delivered. Felix could hear the shouts of his foul pursuers behind him, and the screams of the unfortunates who got in their way. A quick glance over his shoulder revealed that the Skaven were putting anyone in their path to the sword. The sight of it sickened Felix, but in a way he was also glad. Every little pause and hesitation enabled him to increase his lead over them. His wrist throbbed where the little Skaven had bitten it. He noticed that the scroll it had thrown at him was crumpled in his hand. Briefly, he toyed with throwing it away. Instead, he thrust it inside his tunic and continued to sprint. At least he was not weighed down with heavy armor the way his pursuers were. The thought trickled slowly into his mind that the Skaven invasion must have started. The sight of so many heavily armed ratmen in the streets could only mean that they were ready to begin an all-out attack on the city, and that they had no fear of the defenders. Right now, Felix guessed, their confidence was justified. He could not see a single member of the city guard. Of course, most of them were probably up in the noble quarter around the palace, making sure all the guests at the Countess's party were safe. Felix slammed into a wall and rebounded again, turning quickly to hurtle down a connecting alley. This area of narrow lanes and alleys was a veritable maze, and he was not at all sure he was heading in the right direction. He could only move as quickly as possible and listen to the noise of his pursuers, praying that he did not blunder round in a complete circle and run right into them again. He searched his brain for a plan, but all he could come up with was to get back to the blind pig as quickly as possible and warn Gotrek and the others. At least there was a strong force of mercenaries and a potential rallying point for any human warriors. Now all he had to do was find a way out. His heart filled with fear, he continued to run. Lurk tried to keep himself right in the middle of the teeming mass of warriors. He had endured enough excitement for one evening and did not need any more. He focused his attention on keeping HUGE Gotrek in sight. The mould of Packmaster's body of huge rat ogres represented his best hope of protection in a coming conflict. Lurk seriously doubted that anyone would want to attack the huge creatures. So far, the assault appeared to be going well. The Skaven force in this area had met with little resistance. He could smell burning and the distinctive oil and naphtha smell of warpfire throwers. From the backwash of light off to the south, he realized that some of the clan Scryer warpfire throwers were using their weapons on the buildings. Squinting through the shadows, Lurk could see jets of flames squirting out at the tenements. Fire licked and curled at the woodwork. Stone began to splinter and crack under the sheer heat generated by the awesome Skaven weapons. Lurk was not so certain that this was a good idea. He was not sure Seer Thanul would approve of such indiscriminate destruction of his future property. Of course, if the message Lurk had delivered achieved its goal, the Seer would be in no position to voice his objections. He would be dead. Lurk wondered whether the human Jaeger had managed to escape. Part of him hoped not. He could still remember the wretched human's hand clamped on his shoulder and the pain where the iron fingers had bit into his fur. There was no sign that he had been taken prisoner, nor any sign of his corpse. Not that that meant anything, Lurk thought. In these winding alleys, already crammed with Skaven victims, a body could be lying almost anywhere. Already, the Skaven force had started to break up and fan out. Some of the warriors, meeting little resistance, had already begun looting and eating. Lurk was not sure that this was a good idea either. Surely things could not go so easily. Surely they would meet more resistance than this. Where were the accursed human warriors? His questions received no answers. All around him, buildings were beginning to burn. Chang Squi clambered up the sheer face of the cliff leading to the palace of the human breeder, Emmanuel. The line attached to his grapnel held firm. The heavy weight of the rune-encrusted seeing stone entrusted to him by the Seer Thanul personally rested securely in the knapsack on his back. Chang Squi braced himself and scrabbled with the claws of his feet for purchase on the smooth stone of the cliff face. Things were going well. In a few more minutes, he would be in position with the stone placed within the halls of the palace, ready for whatever mighty magic the Seer had planned. he would have played his part in the Skaven victory today and gone some way towards mitigating the disgrace of his failure to kill the dwarf and his human henchman. Hopefully, that painful memory was something which could be laid to rest before this night was over too. Suddenly, below him, in the distance, he heard the faint but distinct chittering of Skaven war cries, and the answering screams of their human victims. Twisting on the rope, he glanced back and saw the eerie glow of what could only be warpfire throwers being used in the distance. Surely the attack had not begun already. The fools were supposed to wait until he was within the palace and the Grey Seer Thanquol's plan had been implemented. He cursed and redoubled his efforts to climb. The noise and the sight of the fire would draw human sentries and other spectators to the battlements above him. Chang Squi could ill afford to have his grapnel line discovered. All it would take would be one human with a knife to slice the black rope, and his long and honourable career would come to an end. Controlling his urge to squirt the musk of fear, the Clan Eshin assassin pulled himself upward. The strange greenish light in the sky confirmed Felix's suspicions that the invasion had indeed begun. He recognized the color of the flames as being the same as those produced by the strange weapons which had destroyed the College of Engineering. Looking back, he could see fire leaping from the rooftops of blazing tenements. The college had been a separate building, isolated behind the walls of its own grounds. The buildings here, in this part of the city, in contrast, were packed as tightly together as drunks in a crowded tavern. Many of them leaned conspiratorially over alleyways. Some were linked by high bridges far above the ground and by supporting arches in the alleys. Most had thatched roofs and wooden support beams. Felix shivered in spite of himself. The conflagration was going to spread quickly. The city was going to burn. Still, at least for the moment, he seemed to have lost his pursuers. There was not a ratman in sight. Better yet, he recognized this street at last and knew that he was not too far from the blind pig. He paused, leaning forward with his hands braced on his knees, panting for breath and shaking his head to clear the sweat from his eyes. Once he reached the tavern, he would be able to put together a plan with Gotrek and the others. Suddenly, from the mouth of an alley nearby, he heard a shrieked war cry. Looking up, he saw a large group of Skaven erupt out onto the cobbled street. Gathering up all his energy, Felix ran for his life. Grey Seer Thanquol led his elite force of storm vermin into position. His keen Grey Seer's intuition told him that directly above them was the palace. He could sense its presence. He trampled the corpse of the sewer watchman beneath his paw and allowed himself to gloat. So far, the Clan Eshin assassins had done their work. every human in the sewers who might have given away their presence was dead. By now, teams of gutter runners would be in position at the base of the cliff on which the castle rested. Hopefully, by now, Chang Squi would be in position. Thanul produced the scrying stone from within his robes. He began to mutter the incantations which would link it to the twin carried by the leader of the Eshin forces. Now would be the time for a mighty feat of sorcery, one that would grant the Skaven swift and inevitable victory. In order to perform it, Thanul knew he would need vast amounts of power, and therein lay the danger. In order to acquire enough mystical energy to power the spells that he needed to perform, Thanul would have to consume an enormous amount of warpstone, and that had its dangers. This was not the mild, refined stuff which made up his snuff. No, this was the pure product, the very essence of magic, concentrated and purified by Skaven alchemists. It was a substance capable of providing its user with awesome power, but its use carried equally awesome dangers. Many grey seers had been driven over the edge into madness by the corrosive effects of the substance on their sanity. Others had been reduced to mindless chaos spawn by its mutating effects. Taken in large enough doses by those of insufficiently strong will, warpstone could devolve its user into a formless, amorphous thing. But what was that to him? Mightiest of grey seers, Thanul was a practiced user of warpstone, was capable of consuming it in gigantic quantities without ill effect. The things that happened to all of those others could not happen to him. Definitely, positively not. For a moment, brief, niggling doubt flared in Thanul's mind. What if there was something wrong with the warpstone? What if it were not pure, but contaminated with other stuff? Such things had happened. What if Thanul were not as strong as he believed? Mistakes in dosage were always possible, but only for a second did the Grey Seer hesitate, before his natural confidence in his own mighty abilities returned. He was not one to flinch from the dangers of warpstone. In fact, he admitted to himself, he rather enjoyed it. He reminded himself of this as he reached into his pouch and put the first luminous piece of warpstone onto his tongue. It tingled even as he consumed it. Now memories of his long-gone youth came back to him. He recalled his initiation into the use of warpstone. No, thought Thanul, there was nothing to fear here. So thinking, he began to prepare himself, making himself ready for when the correct time came to cast the spell which would grant his forces victory. Ahead, Felix could see the lights of the blind pig. A wave of relief passed through him. If the tavern did not represent safety, at least it had to be better than the nightmare chase through the darkened streets with a horde of shrieking ratmen on his trail. He could see Boris and Stefan, and a host of their companions standing in the street. shielding their eyes as they studied the distant fires. "Beware, Skaven!" Felix shouted, and saw them all reach for their weapons. In moments, swords glittered in the half-light of the burning city. From inside the tavern, a number of armoured figures spilled out into the gloom. Felix was relieved to see the massive, squat figure of Gotrek among them. There was something enormously reassuring under these circumstances about the massive axe he clutched in his hands. Felix raced up to the warriors as they braced themselves for the Skaven attack. Behind him, the Skaven, unwilling or unable to give up the heady rush of the chase, came on like an avalanche of fur and fury. Felix made his way through the throng to stand beside Gotrek. The Slayer had the usual mad look of joy in his one good eye that he always had before combat.
"I see you found our scuttly little friends, manling,"
he said, running his thumb along the blade of his axe until a bright red bead of blood appeared. "Yes," Felix gasped, struggling to get his breath back before the combat begun.
"Good. Let's get killing then."
Doctor Drexler looked around him. Something was very wrong. Many of the warriors had gone to the battlements to look at the fires and not come back. Oswald had already herded the women back into the ballroom. Messengers had been rushing to and fro between Oswald, Countess Emmanuel, and those outside. Something was very definitely happening, and he needed to find out what it was. If he had not known better, he would have sworn that Oswald had ordered the orchestra to play louder to drown out the sounds of the disturbance. That must be it, Drexler thought, knowing that he had guessed the truth. Something was happening, and in order to forestall a panic, Hieronymus was covering it up. He glanced around at the others present and adjusted his mask. Most of the people in the ballroom consisted of ladies of rank, together with a sprinkling of hangers-on, toadies, and those simply too drunk to leave the hall. Of course, there were footmen present, and a few guards too, but the situation was not very reassuring. He glanced across at Oswald, not wanting to divulge the connection between them, but filled with curiosity about what was going on. The secretary was garbed as a wood elf warrior, complete with bow. Drexler walked up to him, still nibbling at a savoury. "What has happened?" he asked.
"Some disturbance in the town, Herr Doctor. Arson, probably worse. With Her Serenity's permission, I have ordered troops from the barracks to quell the problem."
"Nothing wrong in the palace, then?"
"Not as far as I know, but I have ordered the guards to double-check."
"Let us pray to Sigmar that it is only some looters. Things have been dreadful recently."
"I fear the worst," Oswald said, looking up as another courier approached.
Drexler agreed. Somewhere nearby, his sorcerously trained senses told him that powerful magic was gathering. Chang Squi cursed and ducked for cover. The place smelled like a reeking midden. Looking around with his dark, accustomed eyes, he could tell that this was, in truth, a human privy. Well, there were worse places to hide, he told himself, but this was not going to help his mission. he knew it was no use. He was not going to make it to the great chamber above the ballroom that he and the Grey Seer had agreed on. All of the stolen maps of the palace he had studied and still carried in his head told him this. He just did not have the time to get there, and even with his supreme skills at sneaking and skulking, he doubted that he could find his way, unseen, through the mass of humans crowding the palace corridors and heading to the battlements in search of a view of what was going on below. This place was just going to have to do. He took the knapsack from his back and reached within. The heat and the glow produced by the seeing stone told him that he was only just in time, perhaps even a little late. He wondered how long the Grey Seer had already spent glaring out into the darkness of this inside his pack. He shuddered when he thought of the wrath of Thanul. As he squatted down, pressed his nose to the side of the stone, and gave the thumbs up sign. Felix ducked the swipe of a jagged scimitar and lashed out with his sword. His blow took the Skaven beneath the ribs and cleaved upwards in search of its heart. The Skaven gave an eerie, high-pitched shriek, clutched its chest, and died. It fell to the ground even as Felix withdrew his blade. Felix glanced around at the swirling melee. To his right, he saw Heinz dash out the brains of a Skaven leader with the kosh he held in his left hand, while he fended off the attack of another Skaven with the blade he held in his right. Boris and Stefan fought back to back in the teeth of the tide of ratmen. Somewhere in the distance he could hear Gotrek's bellowed war cry. Right at this moment, it was difficult to tell how the fight was going. The mercenaries seemed to be holding their own against the Skaven, and the battle seemed to have attracted the attention of others. Humans were pouring out of the nearby tenements. Some clutched bedpans and pokers and other improvised weapons. Others carried swords and blunderbusses and other, rather more useful-looking, instruments of destruction. It seemed that the citizens had decided that they would rather meet their end in battle with their foes than be burned to death in their homes. That was good, thought Felix, for the mercenaries needed all the help they could get as more and more Skaven were being drawn through the blazing streets to the sound of battle. Even as he stood there, a severed head came flying out of the gloom, spinning, spilling blood from disconnected arteries, spraying all that's below it with a shower of black raindrops. It arced straight towards Felix, and he battered it aside with his sword. Salty black fluid splattered his face, and he fought the urge to lick his lips to clean them. Looking down, he saw that the head belonged to a huge Skaven warrior. He wiped his face with his cloak quickly, worried that something might take advantage of his blindness and stab him. Shaking his head, he moved forward cautiously to where he could see Gotrek shouting. Ahead of him, he could see an enormous ruck. The Slayer stood poised atop what first Felix took to be an enormous mound of bodies, but swiftly realized was a plague cart. A wave of furious Skavens scrabbled to reach him, but were being hewn down by the awesome power of the Slayer's axe. In the distance, Looming over the great mass of lesser Skaven, Felix could see a huge wedge of creatures he had come to think of as rat ogres. Gotrek obviously saw them too, for he dived from the top of the plague cart into the seething sea of Skaven. Within moments, his flickering axe had left a wall of broken and dying bodies all around him as he thrust his way towards the giant monsters that were his goal. Felix debated for only a moment whether to follow him and then pushed forward, shouting, "Follow me, lads! Let's kill some bloody ratmen!" As he hacked to the left and right, he hoped the mercenaries were listening and following. Otherwise, he and Gotrek were in for a hard time when they closed with the rat ogres. Thanul glared into his scrying crystal. His head swam. His brain felt aflame. The power of the warpstone flowed through his veins like a drug. It made him feel dizzy and wonderful at the same time. At this moment, he felt sure he could perceive the underlying pattern of mystical forces focused on the crystal. He concentrated harder on making the thing work. At last, the darkness had cleared. At last he could see the leering face of Chang Squi. It appeared that the clan Eshin assassin had reached his objective. Good, Thanul thought. About time. He could barely maintain the enormous mass of warpstone-fueled mystical energy which boiled within him. He felt so saturated with power that it seemed that at any minute he might explode. His head swam and his vision blurred. Everything seemed to swim around him. Frantically, he tried to remember the syllables of the spell he had memorized so long ago in that great black book in the accursed library. For a long moment, the words eluded him, squirming and sliding just out of reach of his thought processes. Thanul bit the insides of his cheek until he tasted blood. The pain seemed to sharpen his wits, for eventually the words came to him. He opened his lips, and the syllables of his ancient language seemed to vomit forth from his mouth, ejecting with them a roiling cloud of dark, magical energy. Thanul's heartbeat accelerated to levels he would not have believed were endurable. His heart thumped wildly in his chest, and his breathing was ragged and choked. He knew he was losing control of his spell and fought to rein in the flow of power before it destroyed him. Brain-blasting visions danced through his mind, and he knew that his Seer's gifts had been driven to incredible new heights by the unprecedented amounts of warpstone he had consumed. Briefly, his consciousness seemed to leave his body, and scenes flickered through his mind in swift succession. For a moment, his spirit hovered over the city, and he had a panoramic view of all that was happening. Below him, the streets blazed with fire and violence. A river of Skaven raced through the city, killing all that were there in their path. Here and there they had encountered pockets of armed resistance, where human garrisons or just the mobs of citizens had taken to the streets in defense of their homes. He saw swift, savage scuffles, and giant rats devouring the corpses of man and Skaven alike. He saw burning buildings and broken bodies. He saw the whole of the great ancient man-city of Nuln in flames. Thanquol's attention was drawn to one particular struggle which suddenly leapt into focus when he recognized two alarmingly familiar figures. The dwarf and the humans, followed by a disciplined pack of human warriors, were hacking through the Skaven warriors towards the hulking bodyguard of HUGE Gotrek. In his trance state, Thanquol could see the roaring rat ogres, and the appalled look on the face of his henchling Lurk as he contemplated the prospect of imminent violence. He saw the mad eyes of Vilebroth Knoll glaring into space as if he sensed the presence of some disembodied watcher. It looked very much to the Grey Seer like his plan was working and the interfering twosome were about to destroy his bitterest rivals. Good, he thought. Let them. Thanquol would brook no others claiming an unfair portion of his glory. He saw Heskett One-Eye bark instructions to his Jezzail-equipped bodyguards and saw the long-barreled rifles swing to bear on the dwarf. No, no, Thanquol thought furiously. None of that. With an almost imperceptible flicker of his thoughts, he touched the snipers' minds. Their fingers curled on the trigger, but the warpstone bullet went wild, smashing into the skull of a rat ogre, almost killing the brainless beast. The thing roared and went wild, surging forward into the Skaven troops from the rear, killing as it went. Thanquol felt dizzy and realized that he was losing himself in his spell. His power was bleeding away, and if he intended to accomplish what he wanted, he had better do it soon. With a wrench, he sent his spirit soaring back towards the castle. He funneled it into the link with the scrying stone and looked out once more on Chang Squi. Suddenly, with a snap, he was back in his own body again, and the words of the spell were tumbling from his mouth. He concentrated with all his might, bringing to bear all the relentless discipline of his many years as a Grey Seer, and the spell swiftly returned to his control. In the air before him, the dark cloud shimmered and parted, revealing a rift in space running from the point just in front of where Thanquol stood to the ground around Chang Squi's scrying crystal. "Quick, quick, forward!" he shouted to his storm vermin guard. They walked forward into the black cloud, shimmered and vanished to reappear. Thanquol most earnestly hoped in the very heart of the breeder Emmanuel's palace. Ahead of them, Felix could see the rat ogres. They loomed head and shoulders above the crowd, monstrous creatures, man-shaped but with the heads of immense rabid rats. Vast boils erupted through their mangy fur. The stigmata of a variety of foul mutations marred their flesh. Each had paws the size of shovels, which ended in claws like daggers. Huge, tusk-like fangs dripping with saliva filled their mouths. Their bellows were audible even over the din of battle. At the sight of them, Felix felt the urge to halt and flee. He could tell the mercenaries following him felt the same way. The momentum of their charge was dissipating as they contemplated the horrific appearance of their foes. Only Gotrek showed no fear. He ploughed onward, unwilling or unable to be bothered by the fearsome nature of his foes. The rat ogres were no more troubled by the Scrollslayer's arrival than he was by theirs. With an ear-shattering roar, they charged rapidly to meet him. It seemed unlikely to Felix that anything could survive the mad rush of such huge creatures. It was like expecting someone to be able to withstand the charge of a herd of elephants. Nothing should have been able to withstand the onslaught of that huge mass of muscle and teeth and claws. For a moment, all heads turned, and even the Skaven stopped their relentless advance to watch. Completely undaunted by the fact his opponents were twice his size, Gotrek charged on. His axe flashed, glowing red in the lurid blaze of the burning buildings, and one of the rat ogres tumbled backwards, its leg chopped off at the knee. As it fell, the Slayer's axe slashed again and severed its arm. Clutching at the bloody stump with its good paw, the creature rolled over on the ground, writhing and shrieking. Another of the immense creatures reached out and made a grab for the dwarf. Its razor-like talons bit into his ruddy flesh. Bloody droplets appeared on Gotrek's shoulder as the mighty beast raised him above its head. It opened its huge jaws to the fullest extension, as if intending to drop the Slayer in and devour him in one bite. Gotrek brought his axe crashing down. Powered by all the awesome strength of the Slayer's mighty arm, it smashed the rat ogre's head in two. Blood, brains and teeth exploded everywhere. The Slayer went flying backwards through the air, propelled skyward by the reflex action of the rat ogre's death spasm. Seeing the remaining rat ogres begin their advance towards Gotrek's recumbent form, Felix mustered all his courage and shouted, "Charge! Charge! Let's send these foul vermin back to the hell that spawned them!" Not daring to look back over his shoulder to see if anyone was following him, he raced forward into the fray. Chang Squi watched in amazement as the air in front of him shimmered. For a moment, it appeared like a small, bright hole had been punched in the very fabric of the world. Through that hole leaked a vile black gas which smelled of warpstone and dark magic. Even as the assassin watched, the cloud expanded and shimmered until it stood higher than any Skaven. Then the cloud itself parted to reveal a gateway joining the privy in which Chang Squi stood to the place where the Grey Seer was. Chang Squi heard a sudden noise behind him and spun around to see an ornately garbed human enter the privy. Fumbling with his codpiece as if he intended to make water. The human reeked of alcohol. He paused in amazement and looked at the skulking Skaven, then shook his head as if to clear it. "I say," he said, "that's a ruddy good costume." Then his eyes widened further as he noticed the ranks of storm vermin starting to pour through Thanul's sorcerous gateway. He opened his mouth and had just time for one shriek of warning before Chang Squi's throwing knife buried itself in his heart. More and more Skaven warriors flowed into the chamber, bursting out from the privy and into the corridors of the palace. Felix ducked, threw himself flat, and rolled under a blow that would have taken his head off had it connected. Up close, the rat ogres were, if anything, even more frightening to behold. Their muscles were like the cables used to moor ships, and they looked as if they could smash through a stone wall with little effort. The creature's massive tail lashed through the air with a crack like a whip. Worse yet was the smell. An awful combination of animal reek, wet fur, and warpstone. It reminded Felix of old and very sour cheese, but was infinitely stronger and threatened to bring tears to his eyes. He rolled to one side as a fist the size of his head smashed into the ground where he had been. He kicked out at the rat ogre's leg, hoping to unbalance it, but he might as well have been kicking a tree trunk. Hot saliva dribbled from the thing's mouth and landed on his hand. Felix fought down the urge to flinch and keep moving, knowing that his life depended on it. Mad triumph appeared in the monster's small beady eyes. It opened its jaws and bellowed so loudly that Felix thought he would go deaf. The creature reached for him, and from his prone position, Felix lashed out with his blade and caught it across the knuckles with the razor-sharp edge. The rat ogre's eyes went wide in surprise at the pain. Whimpering like a child, it pulled its hand back to its mouth to lick the wound. Taking advantage of its distraction, Felix half rose and stabbed upwards, driving the point of the sword right into the rat ogre's groin. The creature gave a shriek like the whistle of a steam tank and reached down to touch its severed nether parts. Felix drove the point of his blade into the thing's open jaws, pushing it right through the roof of its mouth and into its tiny, malformed brain. The light went out of its eyes as it died instantly. Felix felt a momentary surge of triumph, which faded almost instantly as he realized that the rat ogre's corpse was going to topple on him. Felix sprang hastily to one side as the monstrous form crashed to the ground like a felled tree. Pausing to catch his breath a moment, he looked around. The last of the rat ogres were going down, the mercenaries swarming over it like rats over a terrier, but the victory had been won at awful cost. Many human corpses covered the ground for every rat ogre which had fallen. It looked like only he and Gotrek had bested one of the beasts in a single combat. Still, briefly and temporarily, though it might turn out to be, it looked like the tide of battle had turned in their favour. The Skaven leaders, including the grossly fat monster which had ordered the rat ogres to attack, were flinging backwards to regroup. More and more people were massing in the streets to fight off the invaders. In the distance, Felix could hear the sound of horns and drums as the small army which surrounded the noble quarter began to advance down into the city. He wished he had some idea of how the battle was going. In the raging maelstrom of conflict, it was difficult to say. They had won a victory here, but it was all too possible that the Skaven were triumphant in every other part of the city. Perhaps now would be a good time to make a run for it, he thought. Then he saw the Troll Slayer. Gotrek marched through the crowd towards him, a terrible grin revealing his missing teeth. Mad battle lust filled his one good eye.
"You brought a good fight with you, manling?"
he said. Felix nodded, and then remembered how this had all started. He fumbled within his tunic to retrieve the scrap of parchment, then slowly unrolled it to read its message. Grey Seer Thanul watched the last of his troops pass through the gateway and then stepped through himself. He felt a sense of relief as the mystic portal closed automatically behind him. Even for a Grey Seer of Thanul's awesome powers, holding it open while hundreds of storm vermin poured through had been a terrible strain. Now he could relax and watch his plan unfold before him. His tail lashed in anticipation of his triumph. Victory was within reach. Soon he would hold the human rulers hostage and command them to order their troops to surrender on pain of most hideous death. If they refused, which Thanul rather hoped they would, he would make an example of some of them until they did agree. He was looking forward to some sport. Then, the twitching of his nostrils warned him that something odd was happening, and he squinted around the chamber to confirm his suspicions. Yes, it was true. Even Thanul's warpstone-addled senses could tell that this room was the wrong size, and it did not smell like a great hallway. It smelled like a midden. Thanul stuck his head through the door. He looked into a corridor in which storm vermin milled around in confusion. This was not the hallway they had been told to expect. He could see their claw leader studying his map with a look of puzzlement on his face. The awful truth dawned on Thanul. That incompetent buffoon Chang Squi had placed his scrying crystal in the wrong place. Thanul bared his fangs in a ferocious snarl. It was just as well for the Clan Eshin assassin that he was not in sight, thought Thanul. The Grey Seer swore that when he found Squi, he would flay his flesh from his bones, using the darkest magic he could command. Warpstone-driven euphoria and drugged rage warred in Thanul's mind as he stalked out into the corridor to search for his goal. Felix looked down at the parchment. It was hard to tell in the gloom, but the writing looked somewhat different. Smaller, neater, more precise. Not that it mattered right now, as Felix read in horror what it had to say. Humans! The traitor Grey Seer Thanul will invade the palace this night and capture the breeder Eamon Uyo and all your pack leaders. You must stop him or your city will fall. Also, this Thanul is a very powerful sorcerer and will use his evil magic to stop you. He must die,
or no human in your city will be safe.
Felix looked down at Gotrek, then passed him the note.
Well, he said.
Well, what, manling?
Do we go to the rulers and rescue them from this Skaven menace?
They're not your rulers, manling. Not mine.
I think this grey seer is the thing we encountered in von Hallstatt's house. The ratman which got away. I think it might be behind this whole invasion.
Then killing it would be a great deed, and dying in the attempt would be a mighty doom,
Gotrek rumbled.
Only one problem, then. We're going to have to fight our way through the city to get there.
What's the problem in that?
Who knows how many ratmen stand in our way?
Felix racked his brain for a way out of this dilemma. It would take an army to fight his way across the city. In a flash of inspiration worthy of a Detlef hero, the answer came to him. Lurk Snitch-Tongue cowered in the shadow of HUGE Gotrek. The huge clan Molder packmaster looked at him hungrily. He still seemed to be in a state of shock from watching the defeat of his prized rat ogres.
I thought you said the human and the dwarf had received the message and were on their way to intercede with Grey Seer Thanul.
The message was delivered, Master of Moulders. I cannot be held responsible for what happens next. Maybe they were caught up in the fighting.
Maybe. All of this has left us exposed, though. Very exposed. We must find another Skaven force quickly, or return to the safety of the sewers.
Yes, most perceptive of planners.
Have you seen Heskit One-Eye, or Vilebroth Knoll?
Not since we were attacked, greatest of gorgers.
A pity. Well, let us be on our way.
At once.
Filled with warpstone-fueled rage, Thanul stalked the corridors of the palace. The damnable place was huge, and it was much a maze as anything he made his pet humans run through. His carefully contrived plan had fallen apart because of the incompetence of Chang Squi. It had relied on speed, surprise, and the fury of the Skaven assault to overwhelm the defence. Now his storm vermin were reduced to racing through the corridors and fighting skirmishes with groups of sentries. It was only a matter of time before the humans realised what was going on, concentrated their forces, and began to fight back. Thanul still expected a victory under those circumstances. His warriors were many and bold, but there was always the possibility that something might happen to tip the odds against them. Thanul would have much preferred a sudden, overwhelming victory, not this period of anger and doubt. Heskit One-Eye chittered in excitement. Once again he watched the warpfire throwers sweep through the buildings. These huge human structures burned well. Their wooden supports caught fire easily, and the soft stone and brick from which they were made melted in the fierce heat of the warp flames. Heskit had thought it politic to separate from the others when his Jezzail team had accidentally shot one of HUGE Gotrek's rat ogres. It was an accident, Heskit knew, but the Skaven of Clan Molder were insanely suspicious. Hesit had no desire to have HUGE Gotrek accidentally stab him in the back, so he had led his troops away from the main battle to continue spreading destruction. And how glad he was that he had done so. There was something truly enthralling about watching the machineries of destruction at work, of feeling the heat and flames his warriors had caused warm his face, and watching these giant structures tumble down. Hesit stared upwards for a long time, watching the tenement collapse. It was only at the last moment that he realized that tons of brick and blazing wood were crashing down right on top of him, and by then it was too late for him to escape. Felix leapt onto the back of the plague cart. Bodies squelched under his feet. The stink was appalling. He really would have preferred to stand somewhere else, but this was the only way he could get the attention of the crowd. "Citizens of Thanul!" he bellowed in the orator's voice he had not used since the window tax riots. "Listen to me!" A few heads turned in his direction. Most of the others were too busy hacking at Skaven corpses or shouting gleefully at their neighbours. "Citizens of Thanul! Skavenslayers!" he shouted. A few more people looked at him. They began to tug their neighbours' arms and point in his direction. Slowly but surely, Felix felt the attention of the crowd turn on him. Slowly but surely, the crowd fell silent. These people had seen him and Gotrek slay rat ogres. They had also seen them lead the charge into battle. These people were leaderless and in need of direction. Felix thought he could provide them with both. "Citizens of Thanul, the Skaven have attacked your great city. They have burned your homes. They have killed your loved ones. They have brought madness and plague to your streets." Felix saw that he had them all now. All eyes in the crowd were riveted to him. He could sense the crowd's anger and hatred and fear, and he could sense that he had given it focus. He felt a sudden thrill at the power he held. He wet his lips and continued to speak, knowing that he must sway them to the course he wanted now, or he would lose them. "You have killed many Skaven. You have seen their monsters fall. You have seen their vile weapons fail. Victory is within your grasp. Are you ready to kill more Skaven?" "Yes," cried a few of the crowd. Many still looked uncertain. For the most part, they were not warriors, just ordinary people suddenly thrown into a situation they did not truly understand. "Are you ready to drive the Skaven from your city? For if you do not, they will return and carry you away as slaves." Felix had no idea whether this was true or not, but it was what had done in the past, and it sounded good. More to the point, it sounded frightening. More voices shouted yes. "Are you ready to slaughter these monsters without mercy? For, rest assured, if you do not, they will slaughter you." "Yes," roared the whole crowd in a frenzy of rage and fear. "Then follow me to the palace, where the chief of all this foul breed even now threatens the life of your rightful ruler." Felix leapt down from the cart and landed on the cobbled street. Hands stretched out from the crowd to pat him on the back. More still shouted their support. He saw Hines and the surviving mercenaries give him the thumbs up. He looked down at Gotrek. Even the dwarf looked pleased. "Let's go," Felix said, and they broke into a run. As one, the crowd followed them through the burning streets of the city. Chang Squi drew his long black cloak in front of his face and stalked forward, blade in hand. He kept to the shadows, moving quietly on the balls of his feet, ready to strike in any direction at the slightest provocation. In the dim distance, he could still hear the sound of fighting. From up ahead, he could hear the strange scraping noise that humans called music. He emerged onto a balcony and blinked his eyes, momentarily dazzled. He stood looking down upon a huge chamber. The vaulted ceiling above him was painted with an enormous picture of the human gods looking down benevolently. Enormous chandeliers were holding hundreds of candles, provided dazzling illumination. Down below, an orchestra played, and many gowned breeders and a few costumed males stood at ease, drinking and eating happily. The smell of food made Squick's nostrils twitch and drew his attention to the tables below. They groaned beneath the weight of roasted fowl and pig. Platters of cheese and bread and all manner of savouries were there. So much for starving the city, thought the clan Eshin assassin. Then he realised that maybe the ordinary people were starving, but the rulers had preserved all these dainties for themselves. In this, then, the humans were not too different from Skaven, he decided. Then started at the sound of footsteps on the balcony behind him. Two figures, a male and a breeder, had emerged onto the balcony behind him. Their clothing was in a state of disarray and looked even odd for humans. The man was garbed as a shepherd in some sort of tunic. He carried panpipes and a golden mask shaped to have small horns like a goat's covered his face. The woman, too, was masked, but she was dressed in some sort of dancer's costume, with diamond-patterned tights, a tricorned hat, and a domino mask. They stared at him, and to his surprise, emitted the strange wheezing sound that humans called laughter. They stank of alcohol. Chang Squi was so surprised that he paused in the middle of his death stroke. He had intended to strike them down and withdraw into the shadowy corridors.
"I say, what a super costume," the man said. "You're absolutely wonderful," the woman agreed. She bent over and tugged at Squick's tail. "So realistic." Squick had no idea what they were saying. He understood no words of their odd, rumbling language, but it was starting to filter into his brain that these people were wearing some sort of costume, like high-ranking Skaven performing a religious rite, and they appeared to have mistaken him for one of them. Was it possible that these people were so drunk and so uncaring that they did not realize that there was a Skaven invasion going on outside? To his astonishment, Chang Squi realized that it must be so. Worse, he could see that all eyes down below were on them. He considered pushing the pair off the balcony and ducking back into the shadows, but that meant going back down into corridors filled with fighting storm vermin and an angry Thanul. Another plan struck him. Nodding politely to the two revelers, he put away his blade, walked down the stairs and into the crowds of masked
and disguised humans. He helped himself to a savoury from a tray carried by a passing waiter, picked up a goblet of wine, and strolled through the hall, nodding left and right to those he passed. Perhaps, if he could find the breeder, Emmanuel, he might yet redeem himself in the eyes of Grey Seer Thanul. Vile Thanul looked up in astonishment at the unrushing horde of humans. Where had they all come from? How had they mustered such a force so quickly? Had Grey Seer Thanul underestimated their numbers? Certainly that was possible, and if so, just another example of the Grey Seer's incompetence. Not that it would make any difference if he did not get out of their way. He had spent the night since the invasion force erupted from the sewer, wandering lost through the twisting maze of alleys and lanes, killing any humans he encountered, and trying to locate HUGE Gotrek and the others. He cursed the initial blind rush which had separated them all. Now he was left to face this horde of humans without any sort of bodyguard. He looked up and realized that he recognized the leaders of the charge, and what was worse, they recognized him. It was the human and the dwarf who had interrupted his ritual and destroyed the cauldron of 1,000 poxes. For a moment, a vast righteous anger swept through vile Thanul. Almost without thinking, he summoned his powers and an eerie green light swept into being. Around his head and paws, he mumbled the chant that would summon destructive spirits of disease to smite his foes. The humans did not even slow their headlong rush. Vile Thanul realized that they could not. The ones at the back were pushing the ones at the front of the herd forward. If the leaders slowed, they would be trampled. He kept chanting, desperate now to summon the powers which would protect him, knowing that most likely it was already too late. The humans were upon him. The last thing vile Thanul saw was a huge axe descending towards his skull. Felix shuddered. He had recognized the green-robed ratman in the last seconds before the crowd had trampled it. It was the plague priest from the cemetery, and Felix was glad that it was dead. He was warm now, sweating from exertion and the heat of the blazing buildings which surrounded them. He tried to ignore the screams of those trapped within and focus on taking vengeance on those responsible. Somewhere, off in the distance, he heard a crashing sound. A pillar of sparks rose skyward as a tenement collapsed. Felix knew that if anyone survived this, they would have their work cut out rebuilding the city. This was as bad as the Great Fire of Altdorf. They hit the slopes around the palace, and Felix noticed that many of the buildings were intact. They were like his brother's house, small fortresses as well as mansions. Ahead of them was a force clad in the black tabards of the non-city guard. They had their halberds raised to repel a charge, but lowered them, confused, when they saw that the mob were human, rather than ratmen. "Skaven!" he shouted. "There are Skaven in the palace!"
Yeah.
He did not know whether the captain of the guard believed him or not, but he did not have much choice. If his men stood there much longer, they would either have to use their weapons on their fellow citizens or be trampled underfoot. The captain made a snap decision. He barked an order, and his men stood aside. Felix could see that the great gate of the palace was still open. It must have been left that way to allow the coaches of the guests to enter, Felix decided. He rushed onwards, praying that they were in time to save Countess Emmanuel. Drexler turned to look in the direction of the screen. Suddenly, the balcony seethed with huge black-armoured Skaven. Those were not costumes, he could tell immediately. These were the real thing. Monstrous, man-sized, anthropomorphic rats armed with huge scimitars and bearing round shields inscribed with the sigil of their evil god. He saw a few of the guards, elite troops, move to interpose themselves between the guests and the Skaven. They were cut down swiftly by the disciplined phalanx as it poured down the stairs and into the room. Slowly the orchestra stopped playing. The notes faded out into discordant echoes. Screaming guests in fancy costumes were herded towards the great throne dais by massive, snarling ratmen. Drexler wondered if he should risk a spell, but decided against it. There were too many Skaven for him to affect them all. Where were the guards, he wondered? Where were all the men who had gone to the battlements to look at the fire? Then he sensed the presence of terrible magical energy. Looking up, he saw a huge, horned, grey-furred ratman descending the stairs. It looked like an evil god come to bring doom to all mankind. Thanul strode forward across the corpses of the dead humans. At last, from up ahead, he could hear a gratifying number of screams. It seemed that his storm vermin had discovered the Great Hall at last, and that the human leaders were finally within his grasp. Filled with a tremendous sense of his inevitable righteous triumph, the Grey Seer advanced to victory. Felix led the charge into the courtyard. Looking up, he saw a struggle taking place on the battlements. "Quick!" he shouted to Hines. "Scour the battlements! Kill any Skaven you find!" "Right-o, young Felix," Hines said, rushing towards the steps with the mercenaries in tow. "Follow me, lads!" Felix glanced around at the mob pouring into the courtyard. They looked ferocious, ready to kill anything they saw. A number of them began to race after Hines. "Where to now, manling?" Gotrek asked. "I want to get grips with that ratman wizard. My axe first for more blood." Good question, thought Felix, wishing he had an answer. Think, he urged himself. Where is the logical place to go? The Grey Seer wanted to capture Emmanuel. Tonight, he knew from Drexler a great ball was taking place. The logical place for the Countess to be was the ballroom that Oswald and he had passed through the first time he had visited the palace. Now, if only he could remember the way there. "Follow me!" he shouted, trying to make his voice as confident as possible. Thanul paused at the head of the stairs to survey the great ballroom. He wanted to give the pitiful humans the chance to appreciate the full, awful majesty of their conquerors. He wanted to savour his moment of ultimate triumph. All eyes turned to look at him. He could tell the humans were impressed by his dignity and presence. They always were. The majestic form of a grey seer always inspired respect and admiration in equal parts from all who saw him. He glanced at the crowd and looked around to see if he could find his chosen prey. In truth, he had expected to be able to tell her by the elaborate nature of her costume and by the fact that she wore a crown. But he could see that all the humans present were garbed in strange disguises, almost as if they had intended to thwart him. Well, well, he thought, they would see that a grey seer was not so easily balked. He singled out one of the human males, a man garbed like some primitive tribesman.
"You, man thing, where's your chief breeder? Answer me, quick, quick!"
Thanul asked in his best Reichspiel.
"I haven't the faintest idea what you're talking about, old man,"
came the reply. Sweat dribbled down the man's face. Thanul blasted him with a surge of pure magical power. Women's screams filled the air as the stripped and blackened skeleton of his victim fell to the floor. Thanul selected another victim, a woman dressed like one of the humans' goddesses.
"You, tell me where is the chief breeder? Answer, now, now!"
The woman looked at him blankly.
"What is a breeder?"
she asked. Thanul's answer was to blast her with magic as well. Another charred corpse tumbled to the floor. Thanul selected a man very cunningly disguised as a Clan Eshin assassin.
"You, the chief breeder, where?"
Thanul bellowed. The disguised assassin turned, its tail twitching remarkably like a real Skaven.
"No, master, don't blast me!"
it cried in fluent Skaven. Remarkable, thought Thanul, a human who speaks our language. Then he realized this was no human. It was that damnable Chang Squi, hiding himself among the humans. Thanul looked at the assassin and licked his lips, thinking of how the assassin's folly had almost cost Thanul his triumph, remembering all the other failures Chang Squi had been responsible for. This was perfect, thought Thanul. If anybody ever asked, he could claim that it was all a terrible error. He summoned all of his powers. Chang Squi screamed most satisfactorily as dark magic consumed his body. Thanul gloated for a brief but joyous moment, then picked out another human.
"Yo, where is the chief breeder? Answer, quick, quick, or your miserable life is forfeit." "But I don't know what a breeder is,"
whimpered the fat man, garbed as a huge pink rabbit. Thanul shrugged and blasted him. Yet more bones clattered onto the marble floor. It began to occur to Thanul, even through the warp stone clouding his mind, that there was something wrong with his strategy. The humans did not quite seem to understand what he was getting at. What could it be? Where were their feeble minds going astray? He had asked for their chief breeder, after all. Perhaps if he asked for her by name. He signalled out a cringing breeder and pointed one talon at her.
Yo, are you the chief breeder, Emmanuel?"
The breeder was obviously too overwhelmed by the sheer majesty of Thanul's presence to speak. He blasted her as a lesson to the others that they should reply when asked a question. He selected another male next, hoping that it would be slightly less witless than the breeder.
"You! Where is the chief breeder, Emmanuel?"
The male shook his head defiantly.
"I will never tell you. I have sworn to serve the Countess until—"
Thanul yawned and unleashed another blast of dark magic before the human could finish its speech. He so hated it when they became contrary. His specimens back home in Skaven Blight could be the same way sometimes, particularly after he took their breeders and runts away to experiment on. An amazing race in some ways, certainly, he thought, but so stupid. Out of the corner of his eye, Thanul caught sight of two human breeders muttering to each other. Slowly, he swung his burning gaze towards them. As one of the breeders straightened and one of them strode towards them, she pulled off her mask to reveal a pale but determined face.
"I believe you are looking for me," she said defiantly. "I am Countess Emmanuel."
Thanul was almost disappointed. The warpstone power still surged within him, and he had been enjoying using it. There was nothing quite like the thrill of blasting lesser beings to bits, unless it was the sense of power doing just that.
"Good, good,"
Thanul said.
"You will order your troops to surrender immediately, and I will let you live. Fail to do so, and—"
Drexler shuddered as he watched the monstrous horned Skaven stride through the crowd. Just the sight of it filled him with fear. It wasn't the red glowing eyes or the way its fur bristled that scared him. It was the power it so obviously carried within it. Drexler's mystically attuned senses could see the thing fairly bristled with dark magical energy. He was enough of a sorcerer himself to see that there was something deeply unnatural about it. No living creature should be able to wield or contain such power without suffering the consequences. At the very least, it should go mad. At most, it might explode, blown apart by the vast energy roiling within its body. Where could it have acquired such power, Drexler wondered. The only possible source of so much energy was said to be pure warpstone. Could the creature possibly be consuming the stuff? Such a supposition beggared belief. Perhaps the creature had not escaped its use unscathed. Its slurred speech and stumbling, jerky movements certainly hinted that something was wrong with it. The way its whiskers quivered and its head twitched made it look as if it were in the terminal stage of some fatal addiction. Yes, the creature was mad, no doubt about it. The way it had so casually blasted apart anyone who did not answer its questions to its satisfaction stated that fact clearly. The question now was, what was he, Drexler, going to do about it? He was appalled by his own cowardice. Each time the creature had gathered its dark powers, he had sensed it. He could have at least tried to work a counterspell, but he had not. He had been too overcome by the horror of the thing's appearance, and the thought of what might happen to him if he had intervened. He felt sure that he would lose any mystical duel with this ratman, and that attracting its attention would be fatal. even if he could somehow hold the Skaven mage in check, its black-armoured lackeys filled the room. At a word from it, they would surely cut him down with those cruel swords. So he had done nothing, and 6 people had died. He was proud of what Baron Blucher had done, the way the man had defied the Skaven before he died. Why could he not summon such courage? The healer in him was appalled that he had done nothing to prevent such loss of life. Now the Countess herself stood in peril, willing to give her own life to spare her subjects. Drexler vowed that this time he would intervene if the Skaven attacked. There would be no more magical killings if he could help it.
"I will do no such thing,"
Countess Emmanuel said shakily.
"I would rather die than order my troops to surrender to you, foul vermin." "Foolish breeder! That is just what you will do if you defy me,"
Thanul said. He raised his paw, and dark magical energy played around it menacingly. The breeder flinched slightly, but did not move or open her mouth. Thanul wondered if there was some way around this impasse. Perhaps, if he ordered some of the humans tortured before her eyes, she would weaken. Thanul's experiments had led him to believe such a course would often work. Yes, that was it. Then, from somewhere around him in the ballroom, he sensed a slow build-up of magical energies. They were not Skaven magical energies either. He heard footsteps rushing closer too, even as he turned his head to seek their source.
Well, well, what have we here?
A harsh, grating voice said, like 2 great boulders rubbing together, cutting like a knife to the very core of Thanul's being.
It looks like we're just in time to kill some rats.
Thanul quelled the urge to squirt the musk of fear. He recognized that harsh, flinty growl. The grey seer jerked his head to one side just to confirm his worst fears and saw that they were true. Standing in the entrance to the chamber were the dwarf Gurnison and the human Jaeger, and behind them was a teeming mass of human troops. Thanul howled in frustration and rage. He reached deep into his corrupt soul and hurled all his lethal power at his enemies in one mighty blast. Felix prepared himself to spring to one side as he saw the midnight black thunderbolt gather around the Grey Seer's paw. The nimbus of evil mystical power around the ratman's head was so bright that it was almost impossible to look at. Gotrek held his ground unflinchingly, seemingly totally unafraid, as the enormous blast of destructive power was suddenly unleashed directly at him. There was a mighty flash and a crackling booming noise as of thunder unleashed directly overhead. The air was filled with the burnt metal reek of ozone. Felix was vaguely aware that 2 bolts of energy had leapt from the Grey Seer's paws. One was aimed at him. One was aimed at Gotrek. He closed his eyes, fully expecting to die. Instead of the anticipated blast of incredible pain, he felt nothing except a mild tingling on his flesh and his hair starting to stand on end. He opened his eyes and saw that both he and the Troll Slayer were enveloped in a golden field of energy. Long golden lines raced from the aura that surrounded them back to the hands of Doctor Drexler. Felix could see the look of strain on the doctor's face. Grateful as he was to the physician for saving them, he knew that the doctor could not long stand against a storm of magical power which surrounded them.
"Is that the best you can do?"
Gotrek bellowed.
"Ratman, your life is over."
The Slayer charged through the corona of coruscating energy, and Felix charged right beside him.
"No, no!"
Grey Seer Thanul thought in panic as he saw his two enemies racing towards him. This was not happening. How could this be? How could this abominable pair appear to thwart him in his hour of triumph? What evil deity protected them and kept them alive to interfere in his plans time after time? He bared his lips in a snarl and continued to unleash his destructive energies against the swirling golden shield which stood between the pair and destruction. He could feel it start to give way under the relentless pressure of his magical energies. Unfortunately, it was not giving way quickly enough. At the rate the human and the dwarf were closing the distance between them, they would reach Thanul before he could shred the flesh from their bones. He snarled a curse and reined in his spell, knowing that something other than magic was needed now.
"Quick, quick!"
he ordered his storm vermin.
"Kill them! Now! Now!"
With visible reluctance, the storm vermin moved to the attack. They had heard of this pair. Tales of the destruction they had wreaked among Skaven were legend among the army assaulting Nuln. Their very presence was demoralizing to Thanul's troops. The way the dwarf decapitated the experienced claw leader as if he were a mere puppy did nothing to reassure the Skaven. Nor did the vast howling tide of angry humans flowing into the ballroom. Thanul sensed that the morale of his force was mere moments from breaking. Swiftly, he weighed the odds of victory and saw that his moment had passed and that triumph had slipped through his talons. Now it was a case of measuring his chances of survival. If he left now, while his troops were still slowing down the pursuit, Thanul realized he might reach the privy. Once there, he could use the scrying stone to create a gate back to the sewers. Of course, now with his power at a low ebb, he would not have the strength to hold it open for all his warriors. In fact, he doubted that more than one solitary Skaven would escape through it. Still, he knew the genius of Thanul must be preserved. On another day, he would return to take his revenge.
Forward, my brave storm vermin, to inevitable victory!
Thanul shouted before he turned tail and ran with all of his might. He did not need his Grey Seer's intuition to tell him that the slaughter behind him was going to be a one-sided, merciless. Epilogue. So it was that the Skaven were driven forth from the city, although at great, terrible cost in lives and damage to property. I had thought to rest and catch my breath after our exertions, but it was not to be. The hand of doom reached out for my companion. And so began a journey that was to end at the furthest and most gods-forsaken reaches of the world. From my Travels with Gotrek, Volume 3, by Herr Felix Jaeger, Alt Def Press, the year 2505. Felix sat in his favourite chair in the Blind Pig and finished inscribing the notes in his journal. He would leave this book in storage with Otto until such a time as he reclaimed it. If he ever did get round to writing the tale of the Trollslayer's heroic doom, it might prove invaluable. From outside he could hear the sound of hammers. The builders had been at it for weeks now, trying to restore the battle-scarred city to its former glory. Felix knew that it would be many years before Nuln recovered fully, if it ever did. Still, he was not hugely troubled. Things had ended well, more or less. The Countess had been grateful, but there was not much she could do to reward two criminals wanted by the authorities in Altdorf without antagonizing the Emperor himself. There had been many protestations of gratitude and sweet smiles of thanks, but nothing more. Felix did not care. He was just glad to have avoided being thrown in prison, just as he was glad to have survived the night of conflict which had followed the storming of the palace. He still shivered to think of the savage battles which had been fought in the streets between Man and Skaven. It had taken all night and most of the rest of the following day to clear the city, and even after it was done, most people had remained awake the following night, not quite able to believe they were safe. It had taken many more days of hunting afterwards to winkle the Skaven out of all their hiding places, and he was still not sure that the sewers were entirely free of them. On the other hand, the plague had abated. Perhaps the Great Fire had cleansed the city, or maybe it had simply claimed all the lives it was capable of taking. Drexler claimed that this was often the way with plagues. It had vanished now. No more deaths were reported. No more people had been stricken. And for a wonder, the great plague of rats had ended too. For days, more and more of them had appeared, but they seemed weaker and bore the stigma of mutations, as if something had gone wrong with them before even they were born. Many of the later generations had been stillborn. It was as if they had been created with some deliberate flaw by the Skaven. Perhaps they had been intended to scourge the city and then die out, leaving the Skaven free to claim everything. It was an idea of such devilish cunning that it made Felix shiver. Were the ratmen really capable of such a thing, or had it all been merely an accident? Somewhere in the distance, temple bells rang. Of course, the priests were claiming that their particular gods had intervened to save Nuln. Such was their way. Felix had seen precious little evidence that the Immortal Ones had acted to preserve Nuln at all, but who was he to say? Perhaps they had been there, invisibly shielding the folk, as Drexler claimed. Certainly, Felix thought that Gotrek and himself had been very lucky, and perhaps that was the favour of the gods. The gods had spared others. Otto and his wife were safe, prospering even, as his brother had predicted. There was a great demand for all manner of stuff for use in their reconstruction, and Jaegers of Altdorf were helping provide it. Drexler had recovered almost fully from his sorcerer's battle with the Grey Seer. Felix had been to see him several times since that fateful night, and the man looked as calm and cheerful as ever. One time he had even encountered Oswald at the doctor's townhouse. The spy master had treated Felix with a deference close to hero worship, which Felix had found embarrassing. Hines and most of the mercenaries were well. The old innkeeper had taken a nasty knock on the head, and his head was swathed in so many bandages that he looked like an Arab, but he was still there behind the bar, pulling pints. Felix had no idea where Alyssa was. He had not seen her or Hans since the day before the battle, and he knew no one that had any knowledge of her whereabouts. He sincerely hoped that she was well and had escaped back to her home village. He still missed her. They never found the Skaven Grey Seer, despite searching the palace from top to bottom. All that the court magicians had found were some strange magical resonances in the privy. It was assumed that Thanul had used magic to effect his escape. For the most part, the citizens were happy. They had survived and were rebuilding. In any case, life went on as usual, and Felix was looking forward to a nice, long rest. Having avoided meeting his heroic doom yet again, Gotrek had stomped around like a bear with a sore head in the days after the fighting finished before consoling himself with a 3-day-long binge of boozing and brawling. Now he sat in the corner of the Blind Pig, nursing his hangover and bellowing for ale. The saloon doors swung open and another dwarf came in. He was shorter than Gotrek and lighter in build. A circlet of bright red cloth was wrapped around his head and his beard was clipped short. The tunic he wore was divided into red and yellow squares of ungodly brightness. The newcomer looked around and his eyes widened when he saw Gotrek. He strode across to the Slayer with a purposeful step. Felix closed his journal, put down his pen, and watched with interest. "You are Gotrek, son of Gertie, a slayer?" the newcomer said, speaking in Reichspiel as dwarfs often did when humans were listening. Felix knew they liked no one to hear their secret tongue. "What if I am?" Gotrek said in his most brutish and surly fashion. "Want to make something of it?" "I am Nor Norrison, a bonded messenger to the clans. I have a message for you of great importance. I have come 1,000 leagues to deliver it." "Well then, get on with it. I don't have all day," Gotrek grumbled impatiently. "It is not a verbal message. It is written in rune script. You can read, can't you?" "About as well as I can punch out the teeth of messengers who give me cheek." The messenger produced a parchment envelope with a great flourish. Gotrek took it and tore it open. He started to read, and as he did so, all the colour left his face. His beard bristled and his eyes went wide. "What is it?" Felix asked. "A mighty doom, manling. A mighty doom indeed." He rose from his chair and reached for his axe. "Get your gear. We're leaving." "For where?" "The ends of the earth, most likely," Gotrek said, and he could be prevailed upon to say nothing more. That is the end of Skavenslayer. I hope you enjoyed that. I really enjoyed it myself, and I look forward to reading to you all again very soon. Thanks so much for listening. Take care, and goodbye.